Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to talk about a subject that for some reason college students are always into, and that is sex. We're going to talk about the evolutionary role of sexuality and what we can learn from a discussion about sex and sexuality and these kinds of things in human beings about our evolutionary past, okay? So one of the first questions is, why do we have sexual reproduction? Many years ago, I read a book by a guy who was trying to disprove evolution. And he made an argument that's quite common among people that don't understand evolution. That said, well, it doesn't make any sense for us to actually have sexual reproduction. And the reason why is because there's another option, right? Asexual reproduction, which is what cells do, right? That, you have one organism and it breaks into two, and then each of those can break into two and on, right? And replicate themselves that way. Sexual reproduction has a downside, which is what we call the twofold cost. In order to reproduce, a sexual organism has to find another one of its species, and not just any one of its species, one of the opposite sex of its species, right? Again, remember that sex is about biological reality. Gender is a cultural idea, okay? So we're talking about sex here, not gender. And so they said, well, it doesn't make sense. Any smart organism would not do that. Well, the truth is that's really silly, and it fails to understand evolution, because asexual reproduction, while convenient, is extremely dangerous, because every single one of that organism then, there might be billions of them, but is going to be an exact copy of the first one, right? They are genetically clones. And so because of that, it makes them very susceptible to disease. And we have seen this many times in the world, particularly with crops and stuff, when there is like monocropping and not enough, genetic diversity, that anything that can wipe out one can wipe out them all, right? And so, for example, look at Ireland. My family came here in the 1800s because of a potato blight, and the crops were all pretty much genetically identical. And so you have this absolutely massive wipeout of the staple food in the country, right? And mass starvation that followed afterwards, And so, in truth, sexual reproduction is a way smarter way to go about things, because you get this randomization in the genetics, so that this organism is going to be way more diverse, and this organism is much more likely to sort of last and to make it, right? So sexual reproduction is a way smarter way to go about it. That is why most sort of higher life forms, so to speak, do it, right? So we've talked about natural selection, but I want to talk about sexual selection now, which is something that Darwin did actually mention on the Origin of Species in 1859, right? As we talked about, natural selection is adaptation to the environment, oftentimes due to environmental change, and it makes you better suited to the landscape. It makes you better suited to what you have going on, right? And I'd mentioned this before, these women are actually Nuer, one of these groups that live in East Africa, very tall, very lean, very long legs, very long arms, in order to dissipate heat, right? That's an adaptation to the landscape. But there's other kinds of adaptation, including sexual selection, right? Which is an adaptation based on the desirability of a certain trait by the opposite sex, or we'll talk about it, the ability to compete for the attention of opposite sex, right? As I say, it's not the struggle to survive, it's the struggle to reproduce. And a great example of this is actually peacocks, right? Peacocks are really cool, really crazy animals. When I was in India, I actually saw peacocks in the wild, and it seems like they have a really dumb thing when it comes to natural selection. They are like this iridescent, glowing blue color. When I was in the forest in India, like, you can see them from a long way away. They are just so visible, and it's like, this is basically a big ass chicken, right? Like, everything in this forest wants to eat you. Why would you want to be a bold, bright color, right? Well, the reason why, it turns out, is for sexual selection, that if you do not have really bold colors, right? And again, these are peacocks, not peahens, right? These are the males that look like this. The peahens don't look like this, right? You don't get the attention of the ladies if you don't have this, right? And you don't get to reproduce. There was actually a study that was done, those tail feathers that they have, right? Again, from a natural selection standpoint, it's like it's a tremendous amount of energy that they have to put into those things growing. It makes it more difficult to escape from predators. It doesn't help you fly. Those are butt feathers, not wing feathers, right? Like it seems totally asinine, right? But in truth, what we find, again, super important for sexual selection and reproduction. There was a study that was done at a peacock farm, because people do raise them, obviously, as pets and stuff. And what they did is they took the most successful males, meaning the males that bred the most, and they actually cut off the end of their tail feathers. And so they have this sort of like Y-shaped thing at the end of their tail feathers, and then they have an eye underneath it. There's little dots on there. And it doesn't hurt the bird physically, but they snipped off the end of all of their tail feathers. And what was the most sexually active males, not a single female would have anything to do with them after that, right? So it doesn't hurt them physically, but so this is critically important. Well, this might be a seemingly stupid idea when it comes to natural selection. With sexual selection, it becomes really critical. Okay. And so, as I mentioned, that there are two different kinds here. There's intersexual, which makes you more attractive to the opposite sex. So things like feathers and coloration and things like that. Intrasexual, which means that you are more able to compete with same-sex rivals. So this is oftentimes what we find things like horns and antlers for. Means that I'm able to, kick the other one's ass, and therefore have, sort of sexual access to females, right? Intersexual is sometimes called mate choice, while intrasexual is sometimes just called competition, right? So let's talk about sex in our closest living relatives. What can we learn from this? This is something that is often discussed and often explored by many scholars. There's a book quite recently called Sex at Dawn, which I'll talk about, that basically looked at sex in chimpanzees and bonobos, trying to find sort of a roadmap for human beings, and I'll explain why that's probably problematic. So let's talk about chimpanzees first. Chimpanzees are very close to us. We've only been separated. Our last common ancestor with them was about 6-7 million years ago, right? Chimpanzees share 98.6% of our genetic code, plus or minus a few point somethings. So about more than 98% of our genetic code is absolutely identical to chimpanzees, right? So we're very, very close to them, Chimpanzees live in what is called a troop. It is a multi-male, multi-female group, okay? And we oftentimes look to chimpanzees to see what we're quote unquote supposed to be like, which is very problematic because chimps are kind of assholes. They're extremely violent. They're very hierarchical. Chimps have an alpha male, and then all of the males are sort of ranked below that. Chimps practice cannibalism. They practice infanticide, which is the killing of your own children. They practice genocide. It's been documented of chimps systematically hunting down and killing every male member of neighboring troops so that they can then steal the females, right? And so it's small scale, but that would be a genocide. As I said, they practice cannibalism. They when a new male takes over, once the alpha male starts getting older and a new male comes in and sort of beats him, the first thing that new male is going to do with his allies is go around and kill all of the infants in the troop. The reason why is that when female chimps are nursing a baby, they don't enter back into their estrus cycle. They have sex when they are fertile, right? And so they kill the child they kill the baby so that these females will become sexually active again. But the thing is, the chimps that take over are almost always members of the group, right? They're not chimps that come in from the outside. And as I'll talk about in a second, there's a good chance that the male who takes over, the infants that he's killing might be his, right? And so they kill them and then they eat them. There's a documentary I used to show that students really didn't like, that showed this male sort of snatching this baby from this mother, and she's screaming and screaming and screaming and trying to get it back, and he jumps up on a tree branch and just looks down at her and just bites its face off, right? It's pretty creepy to watch, you know. And so, you know, I've always found it very strange that we look to chimps to sort of figure out our own behavior. Chimps can be also very kind, very sweet. I'm sure all of you have seen like Jane Goodall documentaries and stuff like that. But there's another side to them as well, right? That is a very violent one, right? So let's talk about their sexuality a little bit. As I mentioned, females typically only have sex. They have sex only when they are fertile, when they're in their estrous cycles. And when they enter into that, they will have sex with every single male in the troop, right? So starting at the very top, they follow the social hierarchy all the way down, although it is also common for like sort of lower ranking males to sort of sneak off with the female, like not in the right order, you know, that kind of thing. Now, why do they do this? We argue that maybe it's because by having sex with all of the males, then none of the males really know if that's their offspring or not. And therefore they'll help the female more by giving her food and stuff like that. We see that sometimes, we don't see it other times. And so this is a bit of a theory that doesn't really, you know, kind of pan out all the time, right? It doesn't exactly go anywhere. But yes, so they're very, you know, polyamorous and those kinds of things, you know. Chimps also have, and I'll explain why this is important later, chimps also have the largest testicle to penis size ratio of any of the primates, okay? So I'll explain why that matters. The other one I want to talk about is bonobos. Bonobos used to be called pygmy chimps. For the longest time, we thought they were chimps. You can see that they look a lot like chimps. They're a little leaner. They're not as sort of thick as chimps, not as muscled as chimps, which is why they were called these pygmy chimps. It turns out that actually they are a distinct species. It was caused by a shift in the Congo River. About 2.5 million years ago, if memory serves me, this river actually shifted course and it cut off a population of one organism, but over 2.5 million years, one of them became chimps and one of them became bonobos, right? Bonobos are sort of the dead opposite. We are also equally related to them, right? Because we share a common ancestor with chimps and bonobos, and they broke off from each other later on. So again, more than 98% of your DNA is identical to a bonobo. We are equally related. They're both first cousins to us, right? Bonobos are utterly different, right? Bonobos are very, very different than chimps. Chimps, by the way, hunt. They hunt a ton. They absolutely love meat. They go crazy for it. They get very aggressive when they're hunting. In the Gobi Forest, the number one predator of monkeys is chimpanzees. In fact, when Jane Goodall was doing some of her original studies back in like the 50s and 60s, there was one chimp that she named Frodo from Lord of the Rings. Frodo alone accounted for 25% of all colobus monkey death in 1 year, right? He was that active as a hunter. He ultimately became the alpha male as well. Very violent, very aggressive, also very sweet to Jane Goodall, but, you know. Bonobos don't hunt. They're actually vegetarians. They don't eat animals. They also don't have an alpha male. They have an alpha female. They also very rarely fight and instead choose to resolve conflicts through sex. And so this is female to female, female to male, male to male. If people start to argue, they usually just immediately start having sex with each other in order to diffuse the tension. Again, could not be more different than chimps, right? And again, equally related to us. And so one of the problems that I often have with many of these arguments of trying to look at chimps and say, oh, well, this is natural that humans are aggressive, humans fight, humans have war, these kinds of things. Well, why don't we look at bonobos? Maybe it's not natural. Maybe we need to stop trying to come up with genetic justification for our shitty behavior, right? Because again, bonobos don't act like that, right? And so, which path do you want to pick? Because it looks like we get to pick. Which one is it that we think we are most alike to? Gorillas, also a little bit more distantly related to us. They're kind of a second cousin, right? Gorillas live, bonobos, by the way, like chimps, live in a troop that is multi-male, multi-female. Gorillas do not. Gorillas live in a group that is single male, multi-female. So this is a silverback, this is a male. And I mean, you can see the kind of muscles that we're talking about on this guy. Silverback gorillas can be like 400 pounds, 350 to 400 pounds. Females are about half their size, right? Chimps and bonobos, males and females, are almost the same size. Males tend to be a little bit bigger, but they're damn near the same size. With gorillas, literally the male is double. And he is huge. He could, chimps could rip your arm off if they wanted to. Gorillas could rip your car door off if they wanted to. Again, in this single male, multi-female group, gorillas have exclusive sexual access to all of the females in the group. It is referred to as a harem by biologists, by field biologists. No other males are allowed around that, and so we argue that is one of the reasons why they're so massive, is that intrasexual that we talked about before, they have to be capable of literally just beating up any other male that comes around and wants to have sex with these females, right? This is why you have this massive sexual dimorphism, right? This difference in size between the sexes, right? Chimps don't have it much. Gorillas do. We argue that this is evidence of the fact that they've probably been living in this social organization for a very long time. Male chimpanzees and bonobos don't need to be able to beat up all the other males that come around the females. Those males, just like him, will have sex with that female along with every other female, right? With gorillas, though, they've been doing this for a real long time. They have evolved to be absolutely huge to make sure that they can beat the hell out of all of the other males that come in. Gorillas also, inverse to the chimps, have the smallest testicle size to penis size. The chimps have the largest, right? So, and lastly is orangutans that I want to talk about. Orangutans are their own little thing, man. Orangutan males are very solitary. They don't sort of protect the females. They don't, they're not really around. Multiple females, they live in a multi-female troop and a solitary male. Males come around every once in a while, again, for like mating and stuff like that, but they typically are just alone and by themselves. And so the other primates, the other great apes show us this model of highly sociable behavior. And the orangutans show us the dead opposite. They're also more distantly related, even than gorillas are to us. They're sort of a third cousin. I want to say it was about 15 million years ago that we broke off from them. I'd have to double check on that. But nonetheless, right? So this very, very different social organization that we see. So what does this all mean? What are we supposed to take away from this, right? As I was trying to explain, right? It's very problematic anytime you want to say humans are supposed to be this way. Humans are supposed to do X, right? The truth is, when we look at human cultures and societies, we see that we do every variation of something. And looking at our nearest living relatives for clues about how we're supposed to behave, especially sexually, is also very problematic. So what I was talking about testicle size, right? You probably didn't start the day thinking you were going to learn about, ape testicles. This is what we refer to as sperm competition. So if chimps are living in this group where a female is going to have sex with all the males, you are going to be more reproductively successful if you generate more sperm, right? Because if you've got 20% more sperm than the other 3, 5, 10 males that she has sex with, then you statistically have a better chance of procreating. And so there's natural selection at play here, with the idea that you're going to be able to impregnate the female more than the other males are, right? And so that's where we see with chimps, they have these huge testicles and produce a tremendous amount of sperm because there's evolutionary reasons for that. With gorillas, they don't have to compete with other males in terms of their sperm, because only that one male is going to have sex with all those females, right? And so they have these very small testicles. Well, where are humans? Well, we're in the middle, right? We actually have the largest penis to body size ratio. Our penis is actually larger than a gorilla's, even though they're like 400 pounds. The average human penis, by the way, is 6 inches. But we're in the middle when it comes to testicle size and sperm production and that kind of thing. So, like, which way is it, right? Which one is it? Are we supposed to be monogamous like chimps sort of are, right? Or orangutans? Or are we supposed to be polyamorous like chimps and bonobos? Again, we're in the middle. Which one do you want to pick, right? The book that I mentioned, Sex at Dawn, the argument that they make is that humans are supposed to be polyamorous, that humans are, like, monogamy is BS, right? Well, I'll agree with them that monogamy is a human creation, right? But so is plural marriage, right? The truth is there's no supposed to be, right? There are human cultures and societies that are monogamous and they function perfectly. There are human cultures and societies that are polyamorous and they function just as well, right? And so this idea of supposed to is very problematic. When you look at the sexual dimorphism, you see the same thing. So gorillas are huge sexual dimorphism, chimps are very, very little, and humans are right in between them, right? Males in human males tend to be a little bit larger than human females, more than chimps, less than gorillas. Right. And so, what do you want? This also gets into the conversation about hairlessness on humans. So one of the common things that you'll hear talking about, by the way, I said sperm competition is natural selection. Sexual dimorphism is sexual selection, right? That really big gap in the gorillas and stuff is allowing them to compete with rival males more. Hairlessness actually may be a sexual selection as well. We lost our hair somewhere around 2 million years ago, right? A little more recent. Why did we lose? And when I say we lost our hair, I don't just mean me, but I mean that, like, when you look at our bodies, we don't have hair the way that the other great apes do. Why did we lose our hair? In part because of the adaptation to moving onto the savanna, right? Which I talk about in the lecture on the rise of our genus Homo. As we moved out of forest areas and onto the savanna, we were moving into a hotter area. And so because of that, that's the point at which we see from the genetics that there is a shift to losing our hair so that we weren't as hot. There's a shift to that we started actually getting darker skin, right? And at the same time, we started having more sweat glands. We have way more sweat glands than any of the other apes, like way more, right? Because this allowed us to have thermoregulation in a way that was better than the others. Because, again, we weren't living in a shady, canopied, forest environment anymore. We're out in the sun, we're on the savanna, we're walking, we're hunting, we're running, we're doing all of this stuff, right? And so we started losing our hair. But quite noticeably, we kept it in two places. One is on the top of our head, and that was probably for sun protection, a lot of people argue, and the other one was around our genitals. And there is an argument that this may have been an example of sexual selection, because it sort of, if again 2 million years ago, not wearing clothes, it sort of draws the eye to that area. We also argue that this may have been one of the earliest reasons where humans started forming what we would call a family, right? We were talking about these multi-female, multi-male, single male, multi-female groups. We lived in groups, but having this idea of a family unit of men that are around all the time. In most primates, males come around when females are ready to breed, and then they leave, and they don't come back until the next time she's ready to breed, and they have very little to do with offspring. Obviously, that is not the case with us. Well, why? Part of the reason why might be, as I mentioned previously, sexual swelling. That in all of the primates, you have most of in the old world primates, right? In our parv order, females, when they're in estrus, their genitals get engorged with blood and they turn red. It does still happen in human females as well, but we don't see it, right? Today we don't see it because we wear pants, but also just standing upright, you don't really see it. And it may be that by keeping that hair, it was able to sort of hide that. And because it was hidden, males sort of always had to be around because they didn't know when females would be sexually receptive, right? And so they kind of always had to hang around. They kind of had to always be there, right? And so then that leads us ultimately into this nuclear family idea that we have now of a male, a female, and their shared offspring, right? And so that could be one of the early ways that this sort of, happens, right? And a lot of this gets into what's called sociobiology. Sociobiology is a theory that was put forward by the scientist E.O. Wilson. His book, Sociobiology, actually won, I think it was a Nobel Prize in the 1970s. And it's the idea that you can explain human behavior and society through biology. I have a lot of issues with this. We don't really have time to go into it here, but I very much disagree with E.O. Wilson. I think he's a really cool guy, and I like him as a naturalist and as a scientist, but I think he's wrong. Does biology explain some of our behavior? Of course it does, right? Emotions and fight or flight and those kinds of things. Absolutely, of course it does. But the idea that you can explain all of this through biology is just silly. E.O. Wilson studied ants, right? He studied ants and insects, not people, but then took these ideas about ants and insects and just tried to apply them to people. As I keep saying over and over again, what we see in reality is that human beings are incredibly diverse in our behavior, in our sexuality, in our mating practices, in our family practices, in all of these kinds of things, right? So the idea that you're going to find in our genetic code the answer to how we are, I think is just silly. When you look at the plurality of human behaviors, it's just not happening, right? And so lastly, the one thing that I wanted to note and close on was a comment about anthropology and about science. I've mentioned to you guys before that it turns out that we were interbreeding with Neanderthals many thousands of years ago in Europe, and that a small but notable percent of our genetic code actually comes from them. Well, the truth is that's actually new information to us. When I first started studying anthropology many years ago, in the early 2000s, I was always taught that we didn't have anything to do with having sex with Neanderthals. That was actually the plot point of a very famous book that was turned into a movie with Daryl Hannah called Clan of the Cave Bear, right? Where Neanderthals and humans started having sex with each other, and their offspring was like sort of really smart and strong and fast and all this kind of stuff, right? And anthropologists always said, like, it's a fun movie. I haven't watched it in forever. I'm sure it's terrible now. It's a fun movie, but it's nonsense. That didn't happen. Well, then a guy at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology in Germany figured out a way to extract fossilized DNA from Neanderthals, right? And we'd never been able to do that, but he figured out a technique. And when he did, and he compared it to humans, he went, oh, shit, we were wrong, you know? And the scientific community looked at his research, some people replicated his research, and all of us went, yep, we got it wrong, right? And I point this out because it's an important lesson about science that for the longest time, we said this can't be so. This isn't. Like, we looked at the evidence. There's no evidence of this. Nope. But then we got better evidence and we went, hey, we were wrong. Yeah, cool. Great to know. Awesome. Right? That's what makes science. It's not that science is always right. It's that science is always willing to admit that it wasn't. Right? That's what's important about science. That's what separates it and sets it apart from faith. Right? The best evidence tells me X, but if you get me better evidence that says Y, I'll change my mind. Right? And so, you know, we continue to make discoveries. We continue to learn things. We continue to find out new stuff. And that's a really powerful tool. Right? All right. Thank you guys very much. I will see you next time.